A huge amount has been written about Marlene Dietrich and the Blue Angels since the film was released in 1930. Feminist scholars often use the movie to illustrate Laura Mulvey's notion of the male gaze, and we'll talk about this formative idea in film theory in class. Other academics write about aspects of sadomasochism and humiliation in the film, specifically the torture the professor suffers as a result of his passion for the fickle Lola Lola. But by far the most common interpretation amongst film scholars is the one you're going to read in John Baxter's article. And this is the idea that the Blue Angel was a metaphor for Germany as it descended into World War II. In fact, he begins his article by saying that, quote, occasionally a film becomes emblematic of its historical moment. So let's just cover off a few key ideas from the article here. Baxter notes that in 1929, as Joseph von Sternberg, the director, was making the film, talkies were still very new to Germany. A huge sound studio had just been built in Berlin, but there were still challenges for the film industry, including the fact that now complete dialogue had to be written for the film actors. This was pretty new, really. There had been title cards, obviously, for silent films, and all kinds of gestures in the industry that allowed filmmakers to tell those narratives. But now there had to be dialogues and people actually speaking. So although von Sternberg had hired an accomplished screenwriter, the newness of the talkie medium is clear when you watch the film. It's a relatively quiet movie with some very long silences between speeches and songs. The film was also shot in both English and German. For a long time, the English version seemed to be lost, but then it was recovered. And we're going to see the film in its German subtitled version, as it is generally considered the better of the two versions. Then there was the issue of Hollywood, which had dominated the global film industry from the very beginning. Emil Jannings, who plays the unhappy professor in the film, had already been lured to the US, but the director was determined to bring him back to Germany for this movie. Given there were feelings of resentment felt by the general German population to any movie star who went to live in Hollywood, this casting was a bit of a concern, and it became an even greater concern when it came to Marlene Dietrich, as we're going to see. But Jannings had just become the very first recipient of the Academy's Best Actor Award, and he won his Oscar for his outstanding performances in two American films, The Way of All Flesh and The Last Command. Von Sternberg himself was another X factor. He was an Austrian Jew who, as a child, had shuttled with his parents between Europe and America until the family finally settled in New York when Joseph was 14 years old. He made several films in Hollywood as a young man, but the last two had been unsuccessful, and he jumped at the chance to direct in Germany when the studio offered it. And then there was Marlene Dietrich herself. Baxter, who writes the article, does a fair amount of what seems to be salacious gossiping about the casting process, but the fact was that von Sternberg apparently fell in love with Dietrich as soon as he saw her in a theater production in Berlin. Dietrich was at the time married and mother to a small daughter, but her husband was unfaithful to her, and she apparently had affairs of her own, as did von Sternberg. She was clearly a tempestuous woman, as seen in this little screen test here, where she pretends to argue with her piano accompanist, but all the time just is using it as an excuse to show off her very beautiful legs.
Jetzt aber falsch spielen, verstehst du? Dann gibt's einen Tritt. Wer wird denn weinen, wenn man auseinander geht, wenn an der nächsten Ecke schon ein anderer steht? Man sagt auf Wiedersehen und denkt
Baxter notes that von Sternberg had designed the character of Lola Lola much in the artistic tradition of the Belgian decadent artist Felicien Rops. In his etchings and paintings, there are often cherubs that are attached to female nudes. And you see these cherubs surrounding Lola Lola as well, as in the Blue Angels poster. So in a nutshell, here's the story of the Blue Angel. Emmanuel Rath, who is an old bachelor, is a professor at the town's university, and when he discovers that some of his pupils often go to a speakeasy, the Blue Angel, to visit a dancer, Lola Lola, he goes there to confront them, but he finds himself enormously attracted to her. And so the next night he comes again, and he doesn't sleep at home. He then resigns his position to marry Lola, but his money is very quickly spent, and he's then forced to take a job as a clown in Lola's cabaret troupe to pay his bills. The troupe eventually returns to his hometown in the Blue Angel, where he's ridiculed by citizens and his former students. And as he performs his very last act as a clown, he witnesses his wife embrace the strongman, Mazeppa, and he's enraged to the point of insanity. He attempts to strangle her, but he's beaten down by the other members of the troupe and then locked into a straitjacket. Later that night, he gets away and makes his way towards his old classroom. Destitute and grieving, he apparently dies in remorse, clutching at his old desk. The film was, according to all accounts, a massive hit and the beginning of Dietrich's extraordinary stardom in Germany, even as she was preparing to leave the country. After the Blue Angel wrapped, she left to work under contract for Paramount Studios in Hollywood, and so between 1930 and 1935, she made 6 more films with von Sternberg. So what about the metaphor implied by the Blue Angel as suggested by Baxter? Many other scholars as well read the demise of the professor as synonymous with the downfall of the Weimar Republic, which was a sort of golden age for Germany between the years 1919 and 1930. This was a time when German cinema, theater, literature, and musical works entered a phase of great creativity, with Berlin as the hub of this entire era. After the release of the Blue Angel, Jannings became a favorite of the Nazi government, one of only a few people entrusted by Joseph Goebbels, who was the propaganda minister, with running the German film industry of the Nazi era. After the war, he was not seen on the screen again. He died of liver cancer in 1950 in Austria. It's probably easy then to read Jannings and his professor character as emblematic of a collapsing empire. Dietrich, on the other hand, became an American citizen in 1939 and spent most of World War II raising money for war bonds and performing for the Allied troops. In 1945, she was awarded the U.S. Medal of Freedom. She often said this was her proudest accomplishment. So after a long career in American film and after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Dietrich instructed in her will that she was to be buried in her birthplace, Berlin, near her family. And on May 16, 1992, her body was flown there to fulfill her wish. She was interred in the Friedenau Cemetery next to the grave of her mother and near the house where she was born. Like Lola Lola, Dietrich was tough and smart enough to survive even in the most difficult of times. One question for you. There's a clown who appears throughout the film, and he comes and goes, but usually he's found staring at the professor. Who is he, in your opinion? And what significance does he have both for the unhappy professor and for the film as a whole? Again, we'll discuss this and other details in class later this month. For now, watch The Blue Angel carefully and take a look at Baxter's article.